this is about being a data architect and what is it all about. I'm just curious, are there many data architects in the crowd? Do people go out there and call themselves a data architect? And in social circles, how does that work? You know, that's always a bit challenging. You know, a lot of stares. But you know, I myself call myself a data architect, and that's because I design and build enterprise data models that get used in projects. I look at how the data moves around the organization, across the data landscape, and making sure that the message that's being transferred, the information that's describing the message, doesn't get lost in translation when you move it between places. I use terms that people tell me that describe the data. And sometimes they don't tell me the same term when they're talking about the same stuff. But I want to be able to describe the data that's going to meet their expectations. I want a design that's extendable so that they can add more stuff later on. I want it scalable so that if they want to collect a whole pile of information, I can still handle that. And I really ideally would love to describe it that a non-architect would be able to understand it. I'm fascinated really by how information and data is shaped, structured, used, shared, assumed to be understood. And really, it's my confession that it's my love of data. And this presentation might be better named The Love of Data. There's so much to love. Let me share some of that with you. Let me share you more about what I love. Data. It comes in many formats and even in different colors. What's your favorite font setting? Do you have one? But what else gives that love away? Is it the completeness, describing a whole concept? Each and every part of the concept that you can recognize? How it's arranged, all these set of elements. You can present it in pieces, or you combine it, and appreciating all the possibilities that exist there. Or is it the love of the classification, this organized group with every type you need and any type you can imagine? Your ultimate metadata type value pairing, you might say. Perhaps it's the love of the context that data is implying. This ability to construct an assembly of data, creating a structure that is fit for purpose. The form the data design takes is one that tells you what you need to know. How do you love your data arranged? Do you love them grouped different ways? So, data is only useful if you can understand it. And getting agreement is half the battle. You know, the term you're using to describe the data. So you need to get in some sort of agreement on what its name is, right? What it means, what does it look like? You can read all those things, understanding these various dimensions of the data related to it. So let's get an agreement, right? But who is going to get that agreement? That's getting an agreement, is getting an agreement. Is it the responsibility of the data architect? If it was, what would you get? Well, you might say you'd get an agreement, right? And we all know what an agreement is. Something like contract, and it comes with terms and conditions that it consists of. And that agreement has likely appeared because someone made you an offering in the first place for some sort of service or product. And that offering came out of some campaign, right? Where you just happened to be a part of the audience that was consuming it. And sure enough, yeah, they were offering a service. What was that particular service? The product. Oh yeah, the product's probably made up of some component, which is a bunch of parts, or the service, lots of service items that utilize different resources, and that resource really is, they're all really just these resources anyway that you're pulling together. Resources, of course, meaning materials, labor, and machines. But the material, this data, that's the data, this service, this agreement that you want a part of. That's what you're trying to get agreement on, whether it's the product itself about the data or it's the service around the data. That's what we're after, because really, the terms of the agreement will say, that's the piece of data I'm looking at, and these are this is the conditions that I want for this data, and you know, here's who I want looking after the data. These people are the ones that are going to work on it, and oh, by the way, I'm going to use this tool, this machine, to check on its quality. So, and of course, when you ask the data architect these things, I've got to put the legend on there. So, going around asking for a data architect to get an agreement is not quite the way to go. Creating an agreement, that's something that I can do. So that's something data architects are paid for. We can represent all the aspects of an agreement. Thank goodness for data governance. That's what I got to say. Because the DMBOK tells us one of the deliverables is the business glossary from the data governance capability. The data governance office is out there collecting terms and getting agreements about what they are called and what they mean. SMEs tell us what those terms are. And it's true that the data architect is one of the subject matter experts in the sense that it'll help them make rigorous definitions and completeness in terms of understanding enough about those terms. Because ultimately, we want to use those terms. We want the consistency, no matter what we're doing. That's our goal. Governance also drives accountability. Remember we talked about the term? This term that we're after that's in the, these terms, they're found in many glossaries. And glossaries, of course, contain many terms. And that term actually probably originated in someone's business glossary to start off with. And because that business glossary has lots of terms. And of course, that business glossary is owned by some business unit, right? And the business unit is responsible for all their terms. And those terms, actually, we put those terms into subject areas. And because those subject areas are useful because we describe what's inside them in diagrams, right? And inside those diagrams, we make reference to these things called data objects, lots of them. And data objects are just some sort of an instance of some term we put out there, and that term probably has some rules around it, like some conditions, like it exists somewhere. Oh, it might exist in a valid value list, and that valid value list is going to be owned by some business owner, and that rule we'll probably get some measures around it, like a quality measure in terms of how well we're doing that. And it's going to help be used in the calculation of some metric. And that metric, of course, is going to be applied to a particular indicator. And because we have that indicator, we'll be able to assign it against some business unit just to see how well they're doing tracking this term, right? Because when they start using that term, it's going to show up in someone's plan, right? Someone's going to have a plan. I'm going to use this data, and we better make sure we're monitoring it successfully. And, oh yeah, data objects, they have lots of relationships with other data objects. And of course, you need a legend. Straightforward. I've stunned you. So the terms, right? Now that the data governance capability is out there, they've decided what to call the data, what it means, where it comes from, who knows about it, how it's associated with other bits of data, what rules need to be put in place. But it's time to figure out what type of data we're seeing. Something we talk about, data instance classification. It's funny how you can look at data and say, what type is it? Well, it's either event-related data, master data, or reference data. Events. So recording what happened to start all this interest in needing to know the data. I wanted to book a taxi. I created an event. It's called the old Request Vendor Transport Service. I called a customer about a product. I created another event called Provide Product Opportunity Person Contact. Of course, that's what we would call it. So when you're asked to collaborate in a business process review, the data people are interested in recognizing the CRUD. What's actually creating, updating, deleting, or referring to this data? What's the process that's creating the data? The event is about understanding the link to that business architecture, understanding the process. Is this something that we should record in the business glossary? We also have these master concepts, master data concepts that are shared across the enterprise, right? And we also have reference data concept, these lists of values and types. Okay? Together, basically what I'm trying to do is when we drop these by putting things in these classifications, it's useful when we're assembling the data to put into our requirements. It makes sure that you know the business processes that are creating the need for that data. It's not uncommon for people to be doing reviews of projects and recognizing that they don't have an event that actually created the data. It just appeared. So it's double checks. It also gives you an overview on how many concepts you're looking at. It's going to give you an opportunity to reuse some of these things. Data subject areas, okay? These are these high-level ideas in the Data Management Book of Knowledge, the DIMBOK. The data architecture space, it talks about the enterprise data model at the highest level, and you break it down into subject area models. That's the level I'm talking about. Subject areas, of course, could mean different things to different people. As a data modeler, I put my data models into subject areas, but in the data architecture space, we talk about these large concepts, that we put concepts into different subject areas. And these are just some of the ones that I've used through my career. Probably the most common one is the old party model, right? But is it party or is it stakeholder? And my experience is that when I'm working with industry, they can handle party, but the government never could. They didn't like that idea. They wanted to call them stakeholders. So when I worked for the tax office back a few years ago, 2003 I think it was, I had the pleasure of working with the chief knowledge officer at the time, trying to convince him to use the word party. Was going nowhere. But when I stumbled across stakeholder, he goes, yeah, everyone's a stakeholder, every organization's a stakeholder. Didn't care. It's their data. If that's what's going to win them over, then that's what I'll use. Of course, the same idea, do you call it a location or do you call it a place? Do you worry about legal and regulatory as another subject areas where you're trying to pull those ideas together? Do you talk about arrangements, agreements, responsibilities? Again, obligations, entitlements. So again, this was sort of came back to the old angle on the government as well, that especially financial services, they don't mind talking about arrangement. And I think that's partly due to the IBM reference models that have been out there for a while. But they could never, so government didn't want to talk about arrangements. They wanted to talk about responsibilities. Okay, I can make that work. Products versus services. How many times have you tried to talk about what's a product, what's a service? Isn't the service a product? Is the product? So again, just clearly articulating what the difference you mean, and also this asset versus resource versus artifact was another challenge that you have when you're trying to put together these subject areas. Assets are a real killer for me because you talk to a lot of people and they say, oh yeah, no, my assets, my servers over there, they're my assets. Yeah, maybe from a financial perspective, or maybe they've just used to using that term. As a data architect, of course, I love my definitions of things and I want to be clear that I know what I'm talking about. And asset is a very tricky one to get, to bring up at a really high level. Because one man's asset today is just another man's resource. So anyway, those are all those subject areas. But I want to just, given the sign of the times that we're in right now, environment as a subject area. Are you starting to track more information about the environment? I started tracking to it because I was working for the Department of the Environment. But that's beside the point, okay? But it's certainly opened up this whole idea about how much we are now focusing on the environment and there's a set of information around the environment that we have to start collecting. Maybe you have to think about maybe including that in your space. And the other one is interesting, is the enterprise itself. When you model, when you organize your information, do you embed your own organization that you're working for in this party concept, or do you pull it out into another concept just called the enterprise? Has anyone done that? Has shifted the two? No one care to admit to it? That's all right. Because that's, for me, for my personal experience, by pulling the enterprise out as its own space, it makes definition easier and it also gives clarity on the perspective you're talking about. This is my responsibility as the enterprise to look after these parties, let's say, or I create the products or I acquire the products as an enterprise. Just some interesting things for you to think about. Now it's time to put those terms into models, because as we look in the DM box, the DAMA wheel over there, we're sort of now, we've had the architecture, we're looking at a bit of design. Thank goodness we have these terms, and the data modeling practice tells us that those business glossary terms live in conceptual data models. The common vocabulary terms live in logical data models, and dictionary entries, I guess that's what I coined them, live in physical data models. It's interesting too, because what's the difference between a business glossary term and a common vocabulary? Because they tend to talk about the same thing. For me, again, I love to separate the two so I know when I'm talking about a logical data model, when I'm talking about, what did I say before, when I'm trying to, I want to provide a product opportunity person contact. I'm definitely not going to find that in the business glossary, but I could find it in a common vocabulary because it's standard logical constructs of the information we're putting together. Also, what you might find is that the term might be called first name. The logical term would be given name, and then the physical term would be GNM or something like that. So it's important to understand those things. And is it something that we want the data business glossary also to understand that lineage? I'm thinking that's pushing it maybe a bit far. But it's interesting to know. Because we're building these reusable, extendable data patterns, and we're all constructing it around some reason. Why are we building all these things? And just going back quickly on the idea about these terms and subject areas. So now that we've identified, let's say, all the terms that are related to the party subject area, all the concepts, right? So the party, the identifier of the party, the given name of the, how many different types of parties do we have? All the data about what that term means and what are the attributes behind it, ultimately, they're going to end up in the glossary. And we will probably represent them in a conceptual data model. I don't necessarily like the idea that sometimes I read that conceptual data models are really high-level stuff. I think it lets the business off the hook too often when it comes to saying, what do you really mean by that term? So I'd go hard on that one. Ultimately, these terms end up in data stores. Again, this whole idea that once we get this concept sorted out and we get a logical representation, then we build this physical model, we're going to dump it in a database. And information security certainly is a hot topic. Regulations need to be considered. is this one area that the glossary is going to help us out with? Because there's all these information assets, right, that are either managed by the enterprise or some party. And of course, the enterprise itself has a data governance office. It's also got a board, or the party might be some related party or a third party. And then the information asset that we have to worry about is got these criticality classifications and sensitivity classifications associated with it. Now, I know about this because of the APRA CPS 234 regulation, I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And of course, it comes up with its own definitions. And for me, how do I remember these things? I put them in data models myself, but because what's an enterprise in this context? That's that APRA-related entity. Information asset, what does that mean to them? And they're talking about, right? Information means information. Technology, software, hardware, and data. So they're talking as a data is an information asset. What is criticality? So that's what happens, how grouping data assets into levels of criticality should it become lost or compromised. Not completely clear, but at least we know sort of where they're heading, and there's different levels. And then sensitivity, what's the level of sensitivity should the data be disclosed? And so that's why we tend to include things like, it's restricted, protected, and publicly available. So again, the glossary is going to help me understand security issues as well, and how do I want to be able to build the right data structures around it to meet those information security requirements. Terms that integrate. Yes. There's that term again, right? That term that we said was like an instance of some data object, like an attribute. Well, they're in a relationship with another data object, like a column, because it's implemented as a column. And that term, remember, it has got some rules, like some mapping rules that says, take this attribute and source it from here and put it in over there, or sorry, that column breadth. And then is there transformation going on? What sort of transformation rule is going to happen? Am I changing the data type? Am I changing the data length? Because really what I want to make sure is that the data domains or user-defined data domains of that attribute stays consistent no matter what transformation goes through. So understanding how terms integrate with each other ultimately comes back to, can we record that in a manner that will remember how to do these things? So can I expect the glossary to understand these things? Do I want to put it in there? I'm willing to give everything to the glossary personally. I think it'd be a great idea. And when terms are artifacts, and those artifacts that hold data, the data architect needs to know when we're talking about the thing as opposed to the information inside the thing, if that makes any sense. So if we're talking about an artifact, we might be talking about things like a file, a folder, a document, some content, a binary object, and we usually have some identifier where we can find this thing. And it might be used as a correspondence artifact. And that correspondence artifact tends to get some correspondence delivery instruction associated to say, who's the entity, what's the address I'm using, and what's the nominated instruction container that I'm going to use. And what kind of containers do we have? Well, we have envelopes and messages and email messages and SMS messages. And when you start looking at the information from that angle, you realize I'm actually not talking about the file. I'm not talking about what's in the file. I'm just talking about the file itself. And the glossary is going to help you get to that answer faster. I've had experiences where I didn't realize I was talking about an artifact, but I thought I was modeling what was actually inside the artifact. So let's not get confused about those two different things. And also I would say that there's a whole bunch of metadata, of course, around that artifact, that if I could continue to draw the model, every dimension that you would want to care about that artifact, that document that you stored in your document management system. What's all the information you want to keep about that? But I'm not going there. Creating a single data instance for a term. So, as we mentioned earlier about these subject areas, it provides an opportunity to select some or all of the concepts in a particular subject area and master it in a master data solution. It's not a trivial task, I'll admit, but at least it gives you some boundaries to recognize. Or managing, perhaps doing the reference data in a reference data management solution, which is probably more common in the type of solutions organizations tend to try first. But will the glossary tell me what's included inside a master data management solution or a reference data management solution? I want it to. I want it to know that I'm managing that term as data in a master data system. So I'm asking more of the glossary. And governing these terms for integrated reporting. Well, this is all pretty standard stuff for most of us, I think, out here. You know, data warehousing, that's right. We have a bunch of collection systems, and then we try and integrate use another system to integrate the data, and then we throw them off in these cubes over there for reporting. You know, the designs that we're establishing here are heavily reliant on those enterprise-wide models that we talked about before. And success is more likely when the business terms have been agreed to. Because behind all that, of course, are all these models, these architecture drawings about how we represent the data in these stores. How do we structure them when we pass them between systems? How do we park them in this new system? Then how do we structure them again before we actually pop them into a reporting cube, right? So with the glossary being able to tell us, yep, the data that you've got here is the data you've got over here. Is the glossary going to tell me that? I don't know. I'm pushing the glossary now, I think. I'm really asking more from it. I might be asking too much, but maybe it's possible. Oh, the old metadata. This is where the data architect might fall into a recursive loop unto itself. We can't help ourselves but just love to collect metadata, because after all, it's just data. Nothing to get too freaked out about. It's describing other data, and how much of it should be recorded in the business glossary? How many different properties of the data are we ready to record? The source business line system, an enterprise business function process, a technical implementation specification. It's bordering on enterprise architecture and having a look at this enterprise architecture repository. But how much of that is actually in the glossary versus somewhere else? And whether it should be there or shouldn't be there. I don't have the answer. I'm just, I would love the glossary to have it, and that's why I would love glossaries, because it helps me understand these things. I do know one thing, though. Every time we want to recognize another piece of data in the glossary, someone has to put their hand up to say, I'll look after that. I'll manage that. I'll make sure we understand that. I'll spread the news on that. And that's always a bit hard finding. Does technical metadata go in a glossary? No, that's craziness. Crazy talk. Isn't that what data dictionaries are supposed to be for? Because when I look at metadata, and for me, as you might guess, I sort of have this data modeling background, when I'm constructing an entity or a bunch of attributes inside an entity, I'm capturing all this metadata about it as well. What's the data type, whether it's mandatory or not? How much of that actually is going to make it into the glossary? Does it or not? the whole idea is that we need a common understanding of these things. Good terms do not guarantee quality data. That's right. You know, a glossary you can have a fantastic glossary, absolutely. You know, and I just wanted to make sure that we didn't confuse the idea that if we worked really hard on our glossary, then all of a sudden our data would be perfect. But you know, a glossary could tell you what quality data looks like, and how I think Data Architect helps promote quality is around, again, this idea about at least put it in the right subject area so we're understanding what we're talking about. Find ways to generate some assessments on how good that data is. Ensure enough data is collected about a concept before you actually save that concept. Knowing when to accept only nominated data types. You know, how many times have you captured dates in a string field or numbers in a string field and things like that? People don't think anything of it, but if we're a little more rigorous about that stuff. And of course, I've often been involved in nominating things for data quality plans, and how do we approach that? Is quality a part of the glossary though too? You know, when do we decide what's the priority in the glossary, and how much are we going to put in? So why a data architect loves a business glossary? You know, because first of all, it's not my responsibility. The governance will help build that glossary and take some ownership and responsibility for making sure the content is correct and they have the right people assigned to ensuring it's correct and who's going to review it. But once they've decided all that, then I'll know who to talk to when I want to understand more about it, you know, and the definition, and what does, you know, where in the enterprise that data is used, when do I need to include it in different solutions, how do you construct, and how I construct these useful structures, it becomes easier, because half the challenge and half the time we spend designing solutions is because we're not really clear what we've actually got in that we're trying to design. And you know, why some data needs to be managed more rigorously than others? Well, hopefully the glossary will help you, because it'll be mandated that, yes, that's what's going on. This needs to be more rigorously managed. And that's why I love business glossaries. And that's probably where we come to the end of our presentation. Thanks very much for listening to it today.